As Dave was saying, our theme for the month of December is hope. Hope is always a good time, and in our turbulent world, a good thing to have. And in our turbulent world, it seems like a resource in short supply. As I was planning on talking about hope this month, I figured why not start with a story about hope, rather than talking in the abstract. So this morning, I want to tell the story of Anne Frank. Her story is a fascinating one that I only learned about in any depth this week. Of course, I knew who she was, kind of. I knew that she was a Jewish girl that went into hiding during Nazi occupation of Europe, and that in her time of hiding, she kept a diary that became hugely famous. That's all I knew. One of the reasons that I chose to tell the story of Anne Frank today was to confront my own cynicism. Like I said before this week, I knew very little about her story. In addition to her hiding, I knew that her writing was incredibly famous. If I'm honest, the fame of her writing made her story somehow less compelling to me. And the ability to maintain hope under such circumstances seemed insincere and even saccharine. For years, I have known vaguely who she was, but chose not to look any deeper. I don't think I'm alone in my dismissal of a famous story of hope, whether it's Gandhi or MLK or Mandela or Mother Teresa or Sojourner Truth or Susan B. Anthony. It's easy to say, oh yeah, they're special, and move on. Somehow, the specialness, the hope in those stories allows us to remove them from our own lives as if they're superhuman, religious, mythological beings. For years, I've dismissed the story of Anne Frank precisely because it was too good, too beloved. So as a commitment to hope, I wanted to dust off some of that dismissal. Anne Frank was born in Frankfurt, Germany. Her parents were Otto and Edith. Her sister Margot was 3.5 years older. When she was just 4 years old, Nazi Party took control of Germany, and in a strange stroke of good timing, her father was offered a new and better job in Amsterdam. So they moved, and by February 1934, the family was all together in Amsterdam. They weren't alone in this idea. In that 6-year period, 300,000 Jews left Germany in fear of what was to come. In Amsterdam, the children thrived in school there, and Otto's business did very well. In May of 1940, though, Germany invaded the Netherlands, and almost immediately, oppression of the Jews continued there with segregated schools and segregated living quarters. Shortly after that, they began confiscating Jewish-owned property. So Otto had to transfer ownership of his 2 companies and factories over to a family friend. Now that allowed the companies to keep running, and he maintained employment, but it was in a greatly diminished position. In the midst of all that chaos, Anne Frank turned 13, and in a store window, she saw a little red and white checkered book with a small lock on it. She wanted that for her birthday present to be her diary. Just 8 days after her birthday, she began recording the persecution of Jewish people in Amsterdam. Already, people were being ordered to report for relocation. They didn't yet know the full horror of what that meant, but everyone knew it was deadly business. So the Frank family crafted an elaborate plan to hide rather than be relocated. They moved into a narrow 3-story space within the factory that Otto had run so successfully. The entry was a single door hidden behind a bookshelf. It was in a sort of area of the factory where only the most trusted employees ever went. So on the morning of July 16th, 1942, the Frank family moved into their hiding place. Just 6 days later, another family joined them. Another 3 people, the Van Pells, who were already friends with the Franks. 7 of them in the tiny space. A team of around 6 helpers were their only contact with the outside world. They brought news of the war and the unfolding politics. They also brought food and any personal items that the 7 occupants might need. Everyone knew how dangerous this was. Even the children knew that if caught, these helpers might be condemned to death. From this crowded apartment, Anne Frank recorded her incredibly insightful ideas for a young girl. She spent most of her time reading and studying and wrote in her diary often. And as time passed over the 2 years, she reflected on her previous writings, so she created a version A and a version B of her diary as she rethought some of her earlier ideas. Beyond recording the events of their lives, she also wrote about her feelings and her ambitions. As she matured mentally, she recorded more abstract beliefs about human nature. Probably the most striking of her passages says, "It's difficult in times like these. Ideals, dreams, and cherished hopes rise within us, only to be crushed by grim reality. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart." Her diary is a deep engagement with hope. Of course, she could never have guessed that she would become one of the most well-known literary figures of the world, or that her little red and white diary would be so famous. But she was clear that she wanted her writing to make a difference. She wrote, "I finally realized that I must do my schoolwork to keep from being ignorant, to get on in life, to become a journalist, because that's what I want." Now, part of her aspiration was ego-driven, but part of it was to be a part of a wider conversation, a sort of human conversation. In the creative act of writing, she found an outlet. She wrote, "When I write, I can shake off all my cares. My sorrow disappears. My spirits are revived. And I want to be useful, to bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. I want to go on living even after my death, and that's why I'm so grateful to God for having given me this gift, which I can use to develop myself and to express all that's inside me." Remember, this is a 14-year-old girl writing a personal diary in hiding for 2 years with no clue if her family would come out of hiding or survive. The story of Anne Frank is an incredible story of hope, not one of comfort or personal victory. On the morning of August 4th, 1944, their hidden apartment was stormed by the German police. And to this day, no one knows exactly how they were found there. The family was transferred to Auschwitz, and Otto was separated from his wife and children. Anne lived in pretty squalid conditions with her mother and sister. Some witnesses at the camp say that she was tearful and withdrawn. Other witnesses say that she displayed strength and courage. It's exceedingly difficult to maintain any personal history of what happened in those camps, and that erasure is part of the evil that it was all about. It's not even certainly exactly what caused Anne's death, but most believe it was typhus, as a huge outbreak happened that year. Now, Otto Frank survived his internment, and after the war ended, he returned to Amsterdam, stayed with family friends who were their helpers in hiding. They had collected Anne's diary and papers and gave them back to Otto. Now, it was strange enough for him to read and edit his young daughter's personal thoughts. But as the book grew in popularity, Otto Frank became the curator of his deceased daughter's literary work. The impact of her collection, her writings, can't be overstated. Eleanor Roosevelt described it as one of the wisest and most moving commentaries on war and its impact on human beings that I've ever read. John F. Kennedy said, "Of all the multitudes who throughout history have spoken for human dignity in times of great suffering and loss, no voice is more compelling than that of Anne Frank." It's a sad story, but there are so many glimmers of hope. One aspect is the bravery of the small group of people that risked their lives for 2 years, supplying food and everything else they needed. There's also the tremendous hope, and the way Anne maintained a positive understanding of human nature, even while the world fell apart around her. The hope that's most striking to me, the piece of hope that doesn't depend on circumstances or the kindness of strangers, is the way Anne Frank found freedom and redemption in her commitment to telling her story and her truth. Regardless of the outcome, telling the truth, even in small private ways, is a foundation for hope. Hope is often misunderstood as optimism, the feeling that things will somehow turn out okay. Now, Anne Frank had a good deal of positive inclination. Still, she wasn't sure that things would be okay in the end. Václav Havel has famously said that hope isn't the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that what you are doing makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. That notion of hope has always resonated with me. I'm learning, though, that a commitment to truth is also a necessary piece of the equation. To have certainty that what you're doing makes sense requires an unflinching commitment to the reality of the situation. In a way, hope rests on the foundation of telling the true story, even if it's not heard, even if it's not believed by some people. Anne Frank is an incredible model for the commitment of truth-telling and telling stories of hope. But she's not alone. This past year, a chorus of women and men have also spoken up to tell their truth, telling their stories of surviving sexual harassment and sexual assault. It's a disturbing cultural moment, but I venture to say possibly a hopeful moment as well. It's disturbing because the stories are sad. They run the spectrum from awkward to perverse to violent. Each story is disturbing in itself, and the combination of story after story, survivor after survivor, perpetrator after perpetrator is pretty awful. Some were folks that we had hardly heard of. Some were folks that we were fond of. Al Franken. Damn. From what I can tell, women and men are experiencing this moment a little bit differently. A lot of men, unfamiliar with what it's like to be the object of the male gaze, are shocked by the commonality of sexual harassment. We don't have the experience of navigating the world in bodies that are objectified. And so when we hear how common this is, it's deeply confusing. Women, from what I understand, are experiencing this moment in a different light. Some are surprised by the prevalence. Some, though, are not surprised at all. For many women, this moment, these stories are just reminders of their own survival, either their literal physical survival or the survival of their human dignity. In different ways, it's a disturbing moment, but it's also a hopeful moment. A lot of these survivors are reporting things that happened decades ago. They're not seeking financial settlements or criminal action against perpetrators, and I guarantee you, the moment in the spotlight is no prize. The public recognition of harassment is more akin to notoriety than fame. No woman wants to be known for that part of her personal history. The thing that these survivors have to gain by speaking out is the sanity of naming their truth. Remember, hope is not an expectation of winning. It's not the conviction that everything will be okay, because there's really no good end of those stories for the survivors. Sometimes the only thing we can rely on is the truth that's in our own heart. It's an anchor, a foundation. And the more connected with that truth we become, either by writing or saying it aloud or sharing it in community, the more alive it becomes as a foundation for hope. I survived. We're safe this day, this hour, this minute. The value of truth isn't that it always wins. Stories of hope, stories of truth, stories of resistance. When we tell them to ourselves, they give us a personal foundation, a strength to face the next day. And when we tell them together, we build a movement, an opportunity to create change in our world. It's not comfortable, it's not easy, but it's the foundation for sanity in the midst of this crazy world. Over the past couple of years, Tapestry has embarked on a journey of truth-seeking and truth-telling with regard to racial justice and multiculturalism. So far, that journey has focused on a workshop series that Celia Young has led. We're holding one more of these workshops before we move forward with some congregation-wide work on multiculturalism and anti-racism. To be honest, these workshops are not easy or comfortable. A lot of you have already, how many of you have already done one of the previous two? Okay, so you get one more chance to enroll. They're not easy or comfortable, but they are deeply invested in truth-telling and setting a real foundation for our journey toward wholeness. So I'd like to invite Celia up to tell us a little bit more about this final opportunity for the workshop and your opportunity to be a part of something potentially life-changing.
Good morning. How are you? That was a touching story. Yeah. I have done this diversity and inclusion work for the last 30 years. That's actually my profession. So it has been such a pleasure for me to put together this race and racism workshop series for Tapestry. And like Reverend Kent says, we had close to about 40 people have gone through the workshop. And well, the theme of January is social justice, so it's perfect for us to launch the third and the last series. So this is it. I'm not doing this again. And whatever social justice issues that you are passionate about, which Tapestry has done a whole lot of work around, whether it's immigration, whether it's income equality, whether it's gender work, whether it's religious freedom, criminal justice reform, or environment and climate change, race permeates through all the way. And no matter how progressive we think we are, there are still blind spots to be discovered. And through all these social justice work that we have been doing, we discover the experience of the oppressed, whether it's pain, courage, hope, optimism. Change doesn't happen. Change is not measured by one particular act, but a series of discovery. So we cannot fight for change if we are not willing to discover what's the change we need to do for ourselves. So I wish you sign up. It's really easy to go to Tapestry website, you'll find it. And we'll have 4 Saturday morning to gather from January and finish in February, all right? We did this for Saturday morning because for those folks who have children and who can't do it in the evening, and we do have babysitters, so just encourage you, okay? So I want to see you all in January, okay? Thank you.
And I want to thank Celia. She said, I'm not doing this again. That's because she has put in hours and hours of hard professional work to make this happen for us. So thank you, Celia. There is hope to be found in our truth-telling. It's a courageous act. It's not for everyone, but it's a lot easier when we embark on it together. Amen.